We hope you were able to kick off your day with Yoga ASHE as well as the keynote from Dr. Sapna Sherian. The rest of the day includes 3 breakout sessions.
ASHE has been very intentional with scheduling breaks between all sessions. We hope you'll take some time to rest, refuel, and refocus during this time. Drink water, get some sunlight, and stretch.
Speaking of wellness, we invite you to join us tomorrow as we host the virtual ASHE Dash. We invite all ASHE attendees to get moving in the morning. Use the hashtag ASHE Dash to show us a picture from your route. As one of the co-chairs of the ASHE Dash, I would like to personally thank the attendees who registered for the ASHE Dash and received an ASHE Dash t-shirt with a special note. Proceeds from our registration went to support graduate students who are attending this week's conference.
While the content so far has kept us glued to our screens, we recognize that taking breaks and taking care of ourselves is important. Please enjoy the next session and be sure to take a break afterwards.
Bye.
My name is Eddie Comeaux, Chair of the ASHE Outstanding Book Award Committee and Professor of Higher Education at UC Riverside. Today, I am honored to be joined by the brilliant Patrick Dilley, who is the 2020 recipient of the ASHE Book Award for his book titled Gay Liberation to Campus Assimilation, Early Non-Heterosexual Student Organizing at Midwestern Universities, publisher Palgrave Macmillan. Patrick is an activist, professor of higher education and qualitative research, and professor of women, gender, sexuality studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Hey, Patrick, good to see you.
Hey, Eddie, nice to be here.
How you hanging during this pandemic with the ongoing political and social unrest?
Better since the election. Able to sleep a little bit better, a little bit. Lots of time to read.
Nice, nice. Well, I'm doing as well as I possibly can during this time, balancing homeschooling, classes, other obligations, but trying to do the best I can. Certainly some extraordinary times that we're dealing with today. Well, let's kind of dig into your book. I know this is the first book published on the history of queer student organizations in higher education. Patrick, just kind of to begin, for those who haven't had a chance to read your important and beautiful contribution, Patrick, and as one of our ASHE committee members noted, it's a rare gem. How would you kind of summarize the text?
It is an examination of how students worked on campus and in their campus communities to create a sense of community and a sense of identity for their internal sense of self. Specifically, it was non-heterosexual identity, but the impetus came about at a time when there were a number of student movements and initiatives that were going on. And in some ways, the story, the narrative, parallels other minoritized groups. And in some ways it's unique, but it basically tells the story of how students on the outside were fighting to be seen, fighting to be heard, fighting to be recognized, fighting to be allowed to be themselves and a part of their campuses. And by the mid-1990s, they had in many ways succeeded in doing that. Along the way, though, they lost that initial impetus that was motivating so many of the organizations and the organizing of the women's movement, the Black student movement, the gay liberation movement as a whole in the United States. That notion of the system isn't working and we need to change the system is broken, that impetus shifted very quickly for this student population, and it became very much about how can we provide for the people who are part of the system, the gay and lesbian students who are there. And then it became, how can we get the university to recognize what we were doing? And then it became, how can we get the university to actually do what we think is their job, which is to provide the kind of services that we're doing so we can just be students who are gay or lesbian or other non-heterosexual identities. So it was a sort of a larger story of how the conceptualization of being totally different became reconceptualized as being totally integrated and a part of the student experience in higher education.
Excellent. So we all always know that higher education have had their sort of spaces and sites of expression, sites of community building, opportunities for students to be a part who historically have been excluded from this space. You mentioned the idea that there was sort of this integration, but your explicit title talks about assimilation. Talk about the differences between the assimilation and integration piece.
The tension between the notion of gay liberation being something that should be separated out from general straight society, and the notion that if you're a college student, you are part of a particular kind of function of society. That tension was always there. And even though the impetus of the collective organizations changed, it was not without contention. I think specifically at the University of Minnesota, where Jack Baker was elected the first openly gay student body president. Baker and his partner were involved in ongoing legal battles to be married. And in many ways, he was using his platform as president of the student body at Minnesota to further these goals. He was doing incredible work as well, but many of his critics said, yeah, you're really doing this because you want a platform and you want publicity to be able to be recognized with your partner and be married. And marriage is not what the gay liberation movement was really suggesting was the way to go. Rather, many people who were involved early on in gay liberation said that getting married is being part of the patriarchal system that has been oppressive. It's being part of that straight system that's not allowing us to be who we are. And there were some people who would say, and your very desire to be married is a fake consciousness. It's a construct coming from you growing up in straight society. There were personal political tensions that were very antagonistic in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, Baker is an example of someone who was a very early integrationist. He was part of the system and was reelected. He was apparently quite good in terms of what the general student population thought he should be doing, of the ones who voted. But that conversation about marriage and about equality that he was striving for became the dominant conversation 25, 30 years later. The early gay liberation student movement used a number of familiar kinds of activities and protests in order to make their points on campus. They did die-ins, they did guerrilla theater, they did protests. In the mid to late 1970s, into the 1980s, those kinds of protests died out. They came back in the late 80s and early 90s, as they did nationally. When we think about the work of the activists in ACT UP and in Queer Nation, and the kinds of activities that they were doing, die-ins, protests, zaps, they were the same things that the protesters had done in the late 60s and early 70s. The difference was the students who were using those tactics and protesting in the late 80s and early 90s were protesting for rights of inclusion, not to dismantle the system. So in the late 80s and early 90s, the students were protesting to be allowed to serve in the military, to be married, to be recognized as partners, to have the same social rights, not just campus standing, but social rights. And that was that was sort of like antithetical to what the original gay liberation front student movements were founded in. But like I said, that tension was always there. The revolutionary movement as a whole really died out by 73, 74. Died out a little bit earlier in these Midwestern gay and lesbian student organizations, in large part because there wasn't a sustained body of activists in these relatively small towns in relatively conservative areas, and also because very quickly these student organizations became the contact point, the center, that sort of like the universe for these students who wanted to be able to have a non-heterosexual identity and wanted to be able to find a community. And so one of my contentions is that these student organizations became something in these universities because there was not a greater, larger metropolitan urban area for these students to be able to explore and to fulfill these parts of their development, their identity development. And consequently, the student organizations started providing and creating structure and services that would help this, that eventually they said, hey, this shouldn't be our job as students. This should be something that the university allows and provides for.
Right. And Patrick, I got the sense that, the likes of Jack Baker, they wanted to work within the system to be more inclusive and to sort of think about how we can make the environment more hospitable to all students, and not necessarily pushing against the boundaries and thinking about deep structural changes at that point. But before I take a deeper dive into your text, I want the audience to get a sort of appreciation for what led to this actual research. This is 2 decades of research that you were pursuing, extensive archival data, interviews with members of student groups, reviews of news clippings, organizational and institutional documents that culminated into this book project. Kind of take us through that process that kind of played out for you and the sort of motivation behind pursuing these years of research that ultimately led to this text.
I think really what I wanted to do was to write the kind of book and answer the kinds of questions that I had when I was an undergraduate in the late 80s. And there really wasn't much scholarship at all about gay and lesbian issues. It was just starting to have a generation of scholars who were at a position in their careers where they could start producing this. But the questions that I had and the things that I wanted to know that informed the shaping of this project really came from that point. So it sort of like background, it's been there for most of my life, longer than the project itself. I kept trying in some ways, I guess, to work at this in my master's project at Kansas, looking at creating a gay male identity development model that was actually based on college students and not on, as in Vivian Cass's model, incarcerated men in the 1950s in Australia. In some ways, this was very much related to my dissertation project, which was looking at different identities, coming up with a typology and figuring out how identity and ideations changed over time and in relation to one another for gay male, well, non-heterosexual male, because gay was its own particular identity. Looking at 1945 to 2000 for my dissertation. And I remember very clearly having a chapter in there that was historical analysis. It was my first attempt at trying to write a narrative, a historical narrative. And my advisor very strongly suggested I should not have that chapter. And I very quietly said, but it's there. But it wasn't enough. It still didn't really like do what I thought needed to be done to try to, again, to answer those kinds of questions and have the kind of insight that I was looking for to try to understand this part of history from when I was an undergrad. So, so I got this gig at Southern Illinois in 2001, and my dissertation became a book in 2002. And I decided if I still have these questions, which I did, then I needed to try to answer them. So I did the things that one has to do to achieve tenure. I, had a book, had a number of articles, and then pretty much said, this is really what I'm going to be doing with my life. And I was lucky enough to be at a place that, I want to say this carefully, they didn't really care what I did. I didn't have any real expectation to bring in money. There was a much greater expectation to be working with students, even though we're research university. And so I had some chairs who were quite supportive, and I had other chairs who just didn't care. But that allowed me space and time to be able to go to archives. Anytime that I went anywhere on any kind of a trip, I included University of Northern Iowa in this because I was asked to be an external reviewer there. And this was before I even really knew what the project was going to be. And I was like, can I go to the archives? Can I have half a day built in to be able to do this? So anywhere I went, I was gathering and along the way, I started to map out a web of students and student names. And I was able to start identifying people. When I started, there were more folks who were in a place that they could be able to talk to me if I could find them. I was lucky enough to go to University of Michigan and to Michigan State. Kristen Wren let me stay in her basement, her guest room in her basement, to be able to go interview folks and again, do those archival runs. So anytime I had any kind of money or any kind of time, that's what I was doing. It was sort of like a start and stop. It wasn't constant, in part because I had other duties that I had to attend to, but also in part because I find trying to make sense of this, it took my mind quite a while to try to figure out not just the story, but what the story meant. And then from another level, what that could tell us when we're trying to understand student organizations and student cultures and what it means to be other in a collegiate environment. And then finally, the internet is an incredibly wonderful tool that was just, in its formational years when I started this project. I never thought that I would be able to, for instance, track down a man named Dan Jones, who was the second openly gay person who was elected to student body presidency. And he was at Michigan State. And the name Dan Jones, it's a very common name. Michigan State didn't have any records that they could find about where he went or anything like that. He was sort of like the cipher. But a little bit of obsessive compulsiveness and a little bit of determination and a lot of internet connection. And I finally tracked him down through a listing in his father's obituary and tracked him down and was able to find him. And it was really rewarding to talk with these former student activists, having sort of been one, having that connection of the people who came before me, but also because so much of this story was untold, and being able to get these little pieces about how crap unrolled and who was involved in it. And it really helped me show in like I hope, an affective as well as a cognitive way, what was required to create change. Oftentimes my students they don't think in sort of historical context. You know, things have always been, we've always had a gay and lesbian resource center. We've always had, you know, things are not utopia, but for students today, they think that this is the way that things are, so it must be the way things have always been, and it's not.
Right. Well,
That was a
Patrick,
long answer, Eddie.
well, Patrick, I won't have you expand on your unique experience in Chris Wren's basement, but I will ask you.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful.
Right. I will, so were there any surprises along the way as you engaged in this project?
There were. There were surprises in terms of the things that I could find when I was able to reach people. There were surprises in the stories that they told. Not surprising necessarily in a, oh my God, I would have never thought about that way, but surprising in the sense that it wasn't ever recorded as part of the process. I'm thinking specifically of a woman named Krista Berger, whom I contacted rather late in the project. She had been involved at the University of Illinois at a time that they were fighting for a non-discrimination policy, and they're receiving a lot of blowback from state legislature and some wishy-washiness from their board of trustees. And she conveyed to me her history of how she worked and worked with members of the board of trustees publicly, but then also privately when there was one who lived in Chicago, trustee who lived in Chicago, and Berger had contacted him like through his wife and said, I want to meet with him so we can talk as people, not as representatives or functionaries of just talk. And so the trustee's wife said, go meet her, and he was like, no, I can't do that. And the wife said, he always goes to this one bar on Sunday afternoon. You can find him there. And so that's what Berger did. And through that perseverance, that saying, I just want to talk to this. The trustee was African-American, and that's how she made the connection, saying, we do have a connection here. There are differences, but there are similarities. And I think we both want the same thing, which is what's best for the University of Illinois. Let's figure out how to do that so that we're not. So she was playing the back room as well as the press view. Finding those kinds of stories were great. Finding other kinds of stories about what administrators did or didn't do was, again, not entirely surprising, but sometimes surprising it to the extent that educational leaders would go to function in ways that we would not think of now as appropriate or helpful. Right.
And you mentioned Dan Jones, and
yeah,
I believe he was a student body president at Michigan State, I think around 1978. And I love the image, by the way, along with the message in the text. How effective would a Dan Jones be today in terms of simply pushing boundaries and going beyond sort of the need to get along, to fit in, to be inclusive, but actually pushing toward more structural change? Is there anyone that you see today that would be similar to a Dan Jones? But how would you sort of situate that in today's context?
Let me just say, Dan's story is not understandable without actually talking. And I mean, on the surface, it looked pretty cut and dry, but when you get into the story, you realize that there was a lot of homophobia and there were a lot of campus politics, student politics going on, and it was really crazy. Dan, I think it's fair to say, would feel that he was not entirely successful. He resigned his presidency because he said he was not able to be effective because, Eddie, does this sound familiar? The student government was split. And that's something that I think frequently happens, at least in terms of the history I understand, frequently happens when you have students who want to make change and who happen to be non-majorative. And his student government was split, and he had said, if I'm not going to be effective, I'm not going to do this. There needs to be someone who can actually make sure that student government runs, but also try to make change, and I'm not the person to do that. I'm not certain. I'm not certain that that many people who are involved in politics, whether it's student politics or national politics or state politics, I don't know that there are enough people who can put aside their ego and their image long enough to do something that they thought might be in the best interest. And in part, this is going to sound like a knock, and it is a criticism of higher education today. We have allowed students to think of the role of a student leader not as a responsibility, but rather as a resume line. And we've taken a lot of the responsibility that students fought and bled for to obtain in the 1960s and early 1970s, and we've just sort of gutted it. And it seems in some ways students go along with it, or they want it, or I don't know. I'm more of a historian than I am of a pundit of current times, but one of the key factors that I think characterized all of the people who were involved in these student organizations through this time period was their level of responsibility, even if it was for a brief period of time, relatively, their notion of a responsibility to their constituents and to people like them who weren't their constituents. They weighed with heavy issues. There were direct consequences to their actions. They could get thrown out of school. They could face direct physical harassment and violence, and many of them did, and threats and bomb threats, and there's like all kinds of like individual stories that help make this make sense. But generally speaking, there were direct threats against the minoritized students who were trying to, if not totally change the system, then to find a place within that system to try to make things better. And along the way, I think things did get better. But I sometimes wonder where the impetus for responsibility has gone.
Right. And you mentioned the fact that there was a divide not only within some of these organizations and not having a sort of shared goals or a common cause. Even you also reference in the text the fact that even outside of those organizations, other groups, Black social movements that were playing out on campus, there was also a divide there. There weren't many shared goals, so they weren't able to sort of leverage a collective to really move towards certain shared goals. Maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that was very true of sort of like the middle period of this study. There were a number of ideological and membership overlaps in the very early part of the study, the late 1960s into 1970. A number of the people who founded Gay Liberation Front campus organizations were involved in Gay Liberation Front movements, say, like at Michigan. Many of the people at Michigan and at Michigan State who were starting these groups were involved with Gay Liberation Front in Detroit, which was bigger. And at Wisconsin, they were involved in Gay Liberation Front, which was in Milwaukee. They were also part of the anti-war groups. They were part of women's student movement, women's student union groups. So there was some overlap of membership. By 1971, 1972-ish, as the anti-war movement was dying down, as sort of like the impetus of the 27% of college students who were really involved started to die down, most of those groups tended to take a more inward shift and think about taking care of their own and trying to become a part of, rather than try to deconstruct the entire society. And so there was less of that overlap until the late 1980s, early 1990s, when across the Midwest, a number of these different student organizations started to make these connections again, starting to say there are deeper structural issues that we share. And they came to this in large part because the universities had stopped responding. It's probably something that never happens today, Eddie, but institutions were not responding to student needs because, there was nobody complaining. There was nobody agitating. There was nobody saying this is wrong in a way that the university had to respond to.
Right.
I'm thinking specifically right now about Iowa State and their efforts to create for their early gay pride days, this connection with Black Student Union, with Women's Student Union, and having these, this coalition, loose coalition, but a coalition that said, we're going to support each other in these larger ways. Oftentimes what happened were the institutions tried to pit a politics of identity response against the students, trying to say, well, there's only so much room at the table. That pie can only be split up so many ways. We can give you a little bit bigger piece if you would just not. And that sometimes worked, but generally speaking, didn't work. The students were bright enough to see through that and talked with one another, which I don't know nowadays if students have that kind of, we're so much more connected and we can share more information, but we tend to be isolated in our own pods of communication, and we don't necessarily have those connections about the talks. And again, I think these things go in cycles, and maybe we're in a low cycle right now of activism. But in the late 80s, early 90s, when we started to see more of a rise in activism in the gay and lesbian community writ large, we started to see it with the students, and the students were making these connections again. And it was gratifying to know that it was in more than one place. It was gratifying to know that students were sort of seeing these big pictures again. But the difference was, this time it was about inclusion. It was about trying to find everyone a place at the table and everyone a piece of the pie, not flipping the table over and throwing the pie out the window.
Right.
I would never throw a pie out the window. I would flip over the table.
Patrick, I'm going to come back to that point about sort of the ideological shift that we saw over time, and drill down as your audience may have simply just picked up your book and saw the cover of your book. I know there's been some critiques of the terminology around non-heterosexual students, and I know Karen Graves had a book review in the History of Education Quarterly, where she said, and I quote, deployment of this terminology can have a discordant impact, sort of criticizing sort of where she thinks that, you know, those who might believe that the personal is the political. And so, you know, you were very clear and explicit early on in the text about why you chose to use the term non-heterosexual students, but maybe expand on that and tell us, our audience, how you sort of arrived at that term.
First, I want to say Karen is a friend. And I went up to her after the book review came out and I said, hey, pal, we're never going to agree on this, are we? And she was like, no, but I'm going to defend to my death your right to say it. I think in some ways it represents, Karen's perspective and my perspective represent differences that are generational in some ways. She's a little more seasoned than I. And she also comes from a feminist lesbian perspective, which is not mine. I had talked about doing that dissertation, which became the book Queer Man on Campus. What I found very early on was that there was a concrete ideation that was named gay, but there were all these other ideations that didn't have names, didn't have labels, they were felt things. So part of what I had to do as a scholar to be able to distinguish these was to give them labels and created a typology to understand these different types of how people came to understand, and a framework that went into how to make a distinction between those. But collectively, what the hell was I going to call it? Because they weren't all gay in terms of having that. And they actually weren't homosexual either. That was a specific category of ideation in the late 40s into the 50s. And so I was one of the first to use the term non-heterosexual. Pasquarello and Terenzini used it later without a hyphen. I still use the hyphen. And Karen's point, which is a valid one, is that a term like that is a contrapositive. It is focusing again on heterosexual as the distinction rather than the innateness of, and here we come into the problem of language and of identity. And that is, I think, all the more relevant now with the ever expanding conceptual notion of what is included in this category. Gay was the general non-gendered term that most of the students in the early part of the gay liberation movement, in the early part of the study, used. And some of the women even still use it informally. Lesbian became something distinct as the gendered aspects of identity formation and of culture that was created became distinct. I remember, oh God, in the early 1990s, I was a graduate student at the University of Kansas, and I was involved in Gay and Lesbian Services of Kansas, which was a student organization. We had these, oh my God, we had these meetings that would last for hours. I mean, like 4 or 5 hours. And we would debate, do we include bisexual in the title? Before I got there, we'd had a huge conversation about, do we include lesbian in the title? Because we didn't have very many lesbian students and they wanted to be separate. So now we were like, do we include bisexual? And if we say that we do, are we going to have any services that we're providing what we know for ourselves? How can we branch? How can we do this? And so these notions of names and relation to identity were not just academic constructs to me, but they were lived things. But I needed a language to be able to talk collectively. And despite the fact that it's a contrapositive, the one descriptor that I think would be common across all of those monikers of identity designations that we have now, LGBTQ, I forbear to say all the others because I always leave somebody out. And I don't mean to, but I'm old, and my cultural mindset is delimited to that. Today's cultural mindset isn't delimited in those ways. And that's why I think non-heterosexual is useful as a collective term to understand how these things fit together, not because they're the same thing, but because they are similar in the sense that they are all juxtaposed to the norm of heterosexuality and are saying in some way they don't fit that dominant paradigm.
Right, right. So in short, you're thinking about a common language for your leadership to ensure that you're inclusive.
Just to get a handle on the big picture.
Right,
when we come into the specifics, then we should look more specifically. We should have better tools. We should have more more articulate language to be able to clarify. But when you sort of extrapolate back up to the larger picture of theory,
right,
then you are necessarily flattening things out. You are necessarily taking away some distinctions because you're trying to find something that's more universal. And that's where language starts to fail us when we start talking about identities.
right.
And oddly, Eddie, I mean, you would know this better than I through your research. I don't hear the same kind of blowback in terms of conceptually using the term non-white or non-majorative.
Right, right.
Which is different from saying people of color, because then you're getting more specific. But
yeah, I would say, Patrick, would probably depend on the circles in which you engage, because there's certainly concerns over the use of students of color, underrepresented minorities, particularly when you see that these racialized experiences may differ. That's where you might see those who are thinking about anti-Blackness and simply trying to separate that from, say, other vulnerable students of color. So I see this happening. It's sort of slowly taking its place, but yeah, there's a number of equity and justice oriented scholars that are doing that work that certainly push back on sort of these sort of broader categories in which students are situated in, and not simply thinking about them as having these separate experiences that might differ in differing contexts. And of course, the intersectionality of that also is playing out. So yeah, it just depends on your lens, and I would like to see more of it. But you know, I think your justification for non-heterosexual students is largely, when you're writing a book, to try to have a common language and write with clarity. And I see your movement in that direction. You know, we have some more time here, and I think we have roughly about 30 minutes, but I want to get to the sort of the core, what I see as a core piece of your work and your beautiful contribution. And I'm also thinking about what's going on today in sort of this political, racially divisive climate we're in. And too often, particularly when we sort of think about neoliberalism and this idea that if everyone is a participant in the so-called American dream, we can all have this sort of upward mobility. We can all sort of, as Jack talks about in the book, just being a part of the system. If we're part of the system and we're actively involved, we'll all contribute. We'll all see the fruits of our labor. And you know, I obviously I don't agree with that. I think we need to disrupt the system. Think about these deep structural changes. And you know, you talk about the narratives of a lot of these non-heterosexual students, that they were more assimilationist driven and less revolutionary during the time period in which you sort of investigated. You know, what might explain that ideological shift when we think about the 60s and the fight for basic human rights? There was really a push toward more structural changes, yet we saw more of a focus on assimilation. And we know that, you know, institutions have never been facilitators of social change, but do you think that was impactful for them to sort of shift ideologically and sort of move toward just fitting in versus trying to be more distractors, disruptors, really agitating the system?
Yeah. God, Eddie, there's like 1,000 things in there to unpack in your question. I would say part of it has to do with what I said before, that there was sort of like this, there was this national collective response to the events in May 1970 that sort of like was this moment of fatigue. I just don't know what to do anymore. So many campuses had like 19 or 20% of the campuses had some kind of shutdown towards the end of that semester. Students didn't know what to make of what was going on in the Vietnam War. Their efforts to stop that hadn't been successful. Their efforts to try to be more open to bring in students from different backgrounds had been less successful perhaps than they had wanted. The structural changes had not occurred. I think many of these students felt they had followed Mario Savio and threw their bodies on the wheels and just sort of got ground up, and they were like, oh my God, what do I have left? So I think that part of this was there was just this big collective drop. But for the students who were still involved in some way in campus organizations for non-heterosexual students, for gay and lesbian students, what seemed to be motivating them was creating a space and place for those students to be able to have the epitome of a collegiate education, of the collegiate educational experience, let me say. That was predicated in many ways in white privilege and in a particular kind of socioeconomic class. So the very students who would be at these schools, who were there for a protracted period of time, who had the capacity and space to be able to, and I think it is a luxury to be able to think about, who am I? It's a luxury we should all have, but who am I and how does this fit in, and how can I be me, and how am I not able to be me if I'm not able to be me? Oh my God, I wouldn't want to diagram that sentence. But the students there were very concerned about helping their students in their community have this sense of belonging and have this sense of staying. It's a form of retention, a form of community building. But it was very much centered on staying and completing and being a part of that community, rather than try to take this community and split it apart. And in some ways, their actions were very much focused on specific needs of the students. They set up speakers bureaus for visibility. They set up peer counseling groups. They set up telephone support and information sharing groups. They formalized dances. Eddie, a surprise. I would not have ever guessed that dancing would have been one of the primary motivators for the creation of so many of these student organizations and for their expansion. Having a specific time and place and space to be able to have people of the same gender dancing together, which was illegal in most of these states during the late 60s into the 70s. Having that kind of a space not only worked in terms of visibility and in terms of creating space, but it was just this desire to dance, which for teenagers in the 1960s and the 1970s was like a major thing. I don't really know why, but so many of them said over and over that having a place to dance at Michigan, when they first had their first declaration of revolution, and we're going to commandeer space. It was a residence hall room where they danced to records. I mean, it wasn't like these were small interior kinds of things that fulfilled the students' needs. Some of the students wanted to make the connections and could make the connections larger, but they didn't. So, in answer to your question, many of the actions that they were doing to provide service to the students, to try to help them with their specific needs, were really geared towards staying and being successful and being at college, not in trying to change that.
Right. So if they were less revolutionary, and what I'm hearing you here is that there were some material benefits to simply being a part of a system and less revolutionary because of their white privilege. But as you know, there are multiple intersecting identities at play here, right? And so one critique of the work might be that there was less of a racial analysis in this work. And so how would you respond to the idea that, well, there might be some white privilege here, but there were also other racially minoritized groups who identified as non-heterosexual students that were also thinking about disrupting and being champions of change. So how might you respond to that?
I would say first and foremost, it's a matter of numbers. So looking in terms of the students who were involved in the student organizations, the vast majority of them through this time period that I looked at were Caucasian. There were some students that we might think of or who might identify now as having multiple intersectional identities, but that was not the dominant thought. And I think it's also important to remember structurally, there was still that politics of identity that was going on. And the students were in some ways being pitted against one another informally, but pitted against one another in terms of services, in terms of representation in a faculty, and in terms of students. Where this starts to change, though, is again in that late 80s, early 90s, when nationally we start to see small changes, but significant changes in the number of students from different racial backgrounds who are coming to campus. And we start to see small changes in those students not feeling like they have to choose one identity. There was one student who was part of Black Student Union at the University of Kansas, and the student organizations all shared a common hallway that they called it the diversity hall. And so it was great for having students from different student organizations with different student backgrounds be in the same place and learn and grow in some ways together. And one of the students said once, I'm not going to go to, a general meeting on a Thursday night. I'll talk with y'all here in the office, but if I go to one of your meetings, then by Sunday when I go to church, all the other 847 Black students on campus are going to know I went. So there was still this social structure, not just even at the university structure, but the social structure that said, you are one, choose one. And I can't blame any student who made a decision that one identity was going to have better services that were guaranteed to be provided by the university over someone else, if the social pressure is that you have to choose one. But in that time period, that's of the late 80s, early 90s, the students again started making these connections themselves and saying, we have common issues, and starting to respond back to that. There were one of the stories that I think is reflective of this comes late in the narrative, and it happens at Kansas. And there had been a number of incidents on campus of violence against Native American students, particularly those who were enrolled at Haskell. It was Haskell Indian College at the time. Now it's Haskell University, but it's also in Lawrence, Kansas, and also discrimination and violence against African American women on campus, and the university just sort of said, oh, that's too bad, and didn't really respond. So a number of different student groups started having protests, and they came together sort of like informally at first, and protested on the grounds of the main library. And those protests grew over the course of about 8 months. And the understanding of the students became stronger about the connections, the sort of like the structural connections, and why the university isn't responding. And, you know, I can understand why the university didn't want to respond, because they didn't want to say that there was any kind of violence against anyone on their campus. But the simple fact of the matter was that there was. And this all sort of culminated in a speech by Angela Davis in the fall of 1990, where several hundred students came out of her lecture one night and surrounded the chancellor's house, which is in the middle of campus at the University of Kansas. It's symbolic now, but at the time, the chancellor lived there. He was not home. And the students said, this is it. This is, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. We want you to respond to all this crap that's going on. That's not just pocketed, it's going on everywhere. And the students were seeing this connection. The university the next day tried to break this up. And I found some of this information in the notes from a lawyer who was an assistant director of student activities, who was part of this, and they were calling the student organizations in, the perceived leaders of them, calling them in and telling them they were going to be arrested, and telling them that they were violating all these things, and telling them that they needed not to talk to those other people, but the university would respond to their issues individually if they wouldn't. And in the lawyer's notes, he's like, this isn't legal. And the students knew it. And the students were able to say, because when they got the calls, they started calling each other, saying, were you called? Yeah. And they're all like, okay, so this is our response. We hang together. We don't capitulate. And we know, because there were law students there, that there really wasn't much of a legal leg for the university to stand on in terms of the response. And eventually the university then had to make a statement, had to try to create efforts to try to make change, which of course, as universities do, it was mainly the creation of study committees, which led to a huge book of campus climate and recommendations that no one really read. And a few things did practically change, but it wasn't a structural kind of a change.
Right. And Patrick, you're an activist.
Am I?
I read up on one of your profiles. At least that's what I saw. That's what was characterizing you on one of your sites. But you know, as you sort of follow the landscape today, what has changed in terms of the common cause, in terms of sort of thinking about sites of community and togetherness and working toward shared goals? Have you seen that shift at all since the work that you've been engaged in over that 2 decades, and then fast forwarding to even more sort of pronounced inequalities, social unrest that are actually playing out not only on campuses, but also writ large?
Okay, so you're asking me to put on a pundit's hat, which I'm happy to do, but I will.
That's why I called you an activist, right?
But I will qualify by saying I'm speaking now as that, not as a historian, because this I don't really study present day at all anymore. I keep up with it. I try to understand it, but I don't study it in the same way. I think generally students don't view themselves as a part of campus the way that they used to. I think there has been a change in their self-concept in terms of their relationship to the university. I think there's been a change in how their parents think of them. Students tend to come to college these days, it seems the experience and data bears out, thinking of themselves as their parents' kids going to college, not going to school, not as adults going to college. And so the level of responsibility is different. The expectation, again, as I said early on, of course there should be these services and these opportunities for students to support students who need the help in that way. But in terms of notions of visibility, in terms of notions of publicity, in terms of these conceptualized identities and communities that students might have, I think those are really, really changed. A number of researchers who look at identity in current students or student-aged populations are talking a great deal, writing a great deal. I'm thinking of Jane Ward, the sociologist, and the psychologist. Oh, don't get old, Eddie. The psychologist. Rich Savin Williams.
There you go.
And for the last couple of years, they've been producing works that are sort of generally saying many students aren't identifying as gay or lesbian. To get back to Karen's point, they don't have this positivist notion. They say that they are flexible or that they are, they don't like labels, which, not to be too critical, but if they went back and looked at the work that I did in Queer Man on Campus, that's part of what I was saying.
Right,
that there are these identities and students aren't identifying in that way. And so because they don't identify in that way, they don't look for that community. And so many students now, it seems, come to college with a community that is virtual and not physical. And of course, in a practical way, we know that more and more students are coming to campus who have other obligations off campus, who have to have jobs, often up to full time, to be able to support themselves. So the demographics and the descriptive lived experience of the students are different from how they were. Again, that goes back into that notion of privilege. Indeed. And who got to go to college and who didn't. So the activism that I would say I would see in college students is there are flashpoints. We saw a flashpoint a few years ago, but it doesn't seem to be sustained. I could be wrong because that's not what I'm looking at, right? I don't look at, but just my notion. A big change that I see though is in ASHE. When I first came to ASHE in 19 something or other, I went to the business meeting and they had just completed a survey of the membership. And at the time, Eddie, I want to say there were fewer than 500. I want to say there were like 350, but I could be mistaken. 350 members of ASHE. And the membership was reflecting a couple of trends. Number one, more and more graduate students. Number two, less of a focus on what ASHE had really been set up to do, which is honestly the kind of work that I do. And more people of difference who were coming to ASHE, and it scared the living pants off of the old guard, and they would not release the data from the survey. And I remember Ana Martinez Alamán was reporting it out, and the officers were like, "Yeah, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about that." And I would say that this was like the first big change in ASHE was happening at that time in the late 1990s. And it really shifted from more of the traditional kinds of study of higher education to a group that was focusing specifically on policy, and specifically on policy for change around equity. This was the time when the American Association for Higher Education shut down, And so there was like this gap, and those scholars didn't have a place, and those scholars happened to become leaders, like Bill Tierney and Estella Ben-Simon and Millie Garcia became leaders in ASHE and started bringing more of their grad students in. So now, 25 years later-ish, ASHE is incredibly different. And I think it's entering this third stage, which is not just based on policy change, but really based on knowledge, content, understanding, and policy change. That I just know that some of the folks who founded ASHE are spinning in their graves, because this is not at all the kind of work that they would have ever thought. But it's the kind of evolution that happens. And here's to come back to your question. So the kind of student activism that I see around these issues isn't about the normal bread and butter student, but rather about the students who decide this is going to be something that they are going to dedicate their lives to, that this is something vocationally they want to do, this is something professionally they want to do. They want to make these kinds of changes and create these kinds of communities that could create not only direct services for students, but also space and place to be able to really effect the kind of change that might change society writ large.
Right, right. And so it sounds to me that you believe that ASHE could be that instructive model for other organizations and groups to actually follow if we're thinking about inclusiveness, if we're thinking about changing a structure that oftentimes excluded a number of groups. And Patrick, I want to quickly revisit, because we're up against the clock.
Oh, yeah.
Something that sort of captures the essence of this book with respect to the assimilation piece versus sort of, to a lesser degree, a revolution. And you mentioned, it was early on in the book, and I quote, "To liberation students, at least those initial organizers of campus gay and lesbian organizations, efforts such as Baker's," and you're referring to Jack Baker here, "attempting to effect change from within a social organizational structure, were difficult to reconcile with their attempts to overthrow that structure. The systems of power that inform those structures would always necessitate a class or classes of excluded and exploited people." So as much as we're moving toward co-creating change, hopefully that's sustainable, there's always going to be an excluded class. Expand on that a little bit for our audience.
I don't mean this as a dig against people like Jack Baker, who were revolutionary in their own sense. But one way of understanding these requests for change, for inclusion, is to be accepted into an exclusionary system, which higher education in the United States and throughout much of Western society has been structured as. For instance, the notion of inclusive excellence on its face seems to be impossible, because the very concept of excellent means that you are not like everyone else. So Baker's and other activists who were striving to create these campus places for students to be, were not questioning who got to be in those places or who was chosen to be. They were struggling to make sure that they were not excluded from them, which is different from a struggle to include people in them. And that, again, is part of what people in Minnesota at the Twin Cities campus were saying about Jack Baker. Still, to this day, a complicated and divisive history there. If the gay liberation movement, writ whole, was really about breaking down the the constructs that created these differences. And this plays out so clearly in larger metropolitan areas like New York. There have been a number of studies about the gay liberation movement, gay liberation front in New York, and how it was initially this very diverse coalition of the very poor and the very wealthy, students and non-students, street activists and academics. Very early though, within a couple of years, Gay Liberation Front split. Gay Academic Alliance was formed, which had most of the wealthier Caucasian educationally credentialed people go toward. And if you look into the history and start talking and reading what people were saying at the time, it was because they didn't want to be around those people, because those people, their interests weren't the interests of those who went into gay academic alliance. Yeah. So that plays out smaller on college campuses in the Midwest, because there isn't a large, compared to New York, a large population of people of different backgrounds. There isn't a large population of people of different color, different racial backgrounds. They're not, it's not a matter of trying to bring everyone in. For them, it was more a matter of survival. And survival meant staying there and being able to be accredited, to be accepted into that managerial society that Clark Kerr had postulated for us.
Well, Patrick, you know, gay liberation, campus assimilation, for my audience, it's a must read. It fills a critical information gap. I encourage you to go grab a copy today, if you can.
Thank you.
Just to kind of, again, I know we're up against the clock. You know, Patrick, if you're a music connoisseur, if you had to place a soundtrack on this book, what song or songs would be at the top of that list?
I would think going back to the beginning of the time of study, to truly understand what was in the minds and in the hearts of these student activists, I would say probably two different songs. One, There's Something Happening Here by Buffalo Springfield, which is would connect many of the different student actions and activists of the time. And the other one, which I wouldn't have said had I not done this project, is Dancing in the Streets by Martha and the Vandellas, because of the importance of dancing, and because if you listen to the lyrics, that song really is about the power of music and the power of moving with music to try to create change.
Right. Any fan of Jimi Hendrix?
You know, I'm not so much. Did you have a song in mind?
No, I'm just thinking about the early '70s along the Watchtower. I'm sure that was a pretty popular hot song during that time. Even fast forward to today, you have recent artists like Kendrick Lamar that might be appropriate for a soundtrack. But again, this is your show, your priority list. But if you're asking me, yes, I would kind of be somewhat eclectic here in terms of identifying folks across the genre. So, Patrick, we'll end with, what's on the horizon? Are you any book tours, anything that you're doing to, engage the text, even during this pandemic? Any virtual sessions that you can shout out to our readers and audience?
None planned, but I'm certainly open to zooming into people's classes. Happy to talk in that regard. It's odd because I finished writing this book 2 years ago, and now I've moved on to other projects, and so it's odd and fun to go back to it and try to get back in that mindset again.
Excellent. So
and I just wanted to say thank you so much for the recognition from the committee, and to thank you. I know from having done your job how difficult it is to try to manage all of that in 8 weeks in the summer. And I thank you, and I thank the committee, and I thank ASHE.
Well-deserved award again, Patrick. Great work. really stretching our knowledge base and contributing to the field. And so we appreciate you. Thank you for hanging out. It was fun.
Thank you.
Certainly we'll cross paths with you again. Take care.
You too. Thanks so much.
All righty.